You're not confused anymore. That assumption only appears because the usual signals are missing. The internal noise that once framed everything as urgent, unresolved, or in need of interpretation is no longer active. There is no sharp relief and no sense of clarity earned through effort. What is present instead is a quiet absence of pull. Thoughts still arise, situations still occur, but they do not demand alignment or reaction in the way they once did. The system is no longer orienting itself around problems to solve or meanings to extract. That can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, if confusion used to come with intensity. But this state is not disorganized. It is unhooked. The mechanisms that once latched onto experience and turned it into urgency have stopped engaging. Not because they were removed, but because they are no longer needed. Nothing dramatic marked this change. It did not announce itself as a breakthrough. It simply became less relevant to stay engaged in the old way. What remains feels neutral, almost ordinary, yet stable. And that stability is not the result of understanding. It is the result of a system no longer being pulled. What often gets called confusion here is actually the absence of internal pressure. In the past, not knowing carried weight. It tightened the body and narrowed attention. It demanded immediate resolution. This is different. You may still lack a clear direction, but there is no alarm attached to that lack. The body is not mobilized. Attention is not scanning for threat. There is no background sense that something must be fixed quickly. This difference matters. When confusion is real, it disrupts function. When the system is unhooked, function continues without friction. Days move forward. Decisions still occur. There is no collapse in capability. The mind may attempt to interpret this as loss or stagnation because it is used to measuring coherence through movement and tension. But the absence of those signals does not indicate a problem. It indicates that the framework, which once required constant engagement, has completed its role. What you are noticing now is not disorientation. It is the quiet that follows when nothing is pulling anymore. The shift did not happen at a clear moment. There was no point you could mark and say this is when it changed. The pull simply weakened until it was no longer there. Situations that once demanded reaction now register without traction. Opinions arrive and pass. Expectations surface and dissolve. The internal movement toward fixing, correcting, or positioning yourself loses momentum. This is not detachment as an act. It is disengagement as a consequence. The system no longer invests energy in maintaining tension. What once felt necessary now feels optional, and what feels optional no longer commands attention. You may notice the mind still reaching for something to hold on to, out of habit rather than need. It scans for a hook because that was how coherence was maintained before. But nothing catches. The old reference points no longer organize experience. This is not because something is missing. It is because the mechanism that relied on being pulled forward has shut down on its own. Because of that, the mind often mislabels what is happening. It calls it confusion because confusion is the closest category it has for a state without direction. But confusion implies instability, and that instability is not present. The body does not register threat. There is no tightening, no acceleration, no urge to escape the state. Attention remains available. Function remains intact. The mind's attempt to create urgency falls flat because there is no physiological support behind it. Thoughts arise suggesting that something should feel wrong, but they do not escalate into action. They are recognized as residual signals from an older operating pattern. When a system stops responding to the same triggers, interpretation lags behind behavior. That lag can feel strange, but it is not a problem to solve. It is simply the mind adjusting to a state where it no longer runs the system. What confirms this more clearly than any thought is the body. There is no background tension preparing for what comes next. Breathing moves without being managed. Muscles are not held in anticipation. Even when uncertainty is present, the body does not respond as if something is wrong. This matters because the body does not negotiate with interpretation. When it does not mobilize, it means the system is not registering danger. Stress may still appear in specific situations, but it does not spread or linger. Recovery happens without effort. This is not calm as a mood and not relaxation as a goal. It is regulation without management. The absence of panic is not something you achieved, it is something that became unnecessary, and that tells you more about the state you are in than any explanation could. Alongside this bodily settling, you may start to notice how little actually captures you now. Information comes in, but it does not hijack attention. Messages arrive without creating pressure. Situations that once pulled you into reaction now pass through with minimal internal movement. This does not mean you stopped caring. It means fewer things have leverage. Before, there was always something tightening the loop, something demanding response in order to maintain a sense of orientation. Now that loop stays open. Attention remains available. Mood is less reactive. You can engage when engagement is required and step back when it is not. This is not withdrawal. It is selectivity without effort. The system is no longer being pulled by every stimulus that appears. As this becomes familiar, a subtle shift appears in how you meet moments that used to carry weight. There is less internal negotiation, less rehearsal. Decisions no longer feel like statements about who you are or where your life is going. They happen closer to the moment they belong to and dissolve once they are made. You may still think things through, but thinking no longer frames your state. There is no extended anticipation and no post-decision review. Action does not need to be justified internally. This is not carelessness, it is efficiency. When the system is unhooked, movement does not require psychological build-up. You act when action is needed and pause when it is not, without needing to frame either as progress or delay. Time also begins to feel different here, not because it slows down, but because it loses its charge. Waiting no longer implies that something is missing. Pauses do not suggest failure or lack of momentum. The sense of being behind fades because there is no longer a reference point pulling experience forward. The future still exists, but it does not exert pressure on the present. Plans can remain open without creating tension. This does not feel empty. It feels unburdened. When urgency drops away, time stops being something to manage. It simply unfolds. And in that unfolding, there is a quiet confirmation that nothing essential is being missed. The way reality meets you in this state becomes simpler. Situations no longer present themselves as tests that must be passed or signals that must be interpreted correctly. Interactions unfold without the usual friction because nothing inside is pushing for a specific outcome. When there is no internal pull, the world has nothing to react against. Conversations resolve without escalation. Circumstances clarify without pressure. When movement is required, it happens without force. When it is not, there is no impulse to insist. This is not because life became passive or compliant. It is because the internal stance that once created resistance is no longer active. The absence of struggle is not dramatic, and that is why it is often overlooked. Yet once noticed, it changes how reality is experienced. Life feels direct, not controlled and not predictable, but uncomplicated. As this continues, the sense of identity that once required maintenance begins to simplify. There is less internal narration tracking who you are, how you are perceived, or whether you are aligned with some internal standard. Identity no longer needs to be carried forward through effort. It adapts as needed and recedes when it is not required. You may notice that you explain yourself less, not as a strategy, but because explanation no longer feels necessary to remain coherent. Action serves what is present rather than reinforcing an image. This does not remove depth or meaning. It removes performance. What remains is functional and quiet. You are no longer sustaining a version of yourself through tension. You are responding as needed, without referencing who you are supposed to be. As this settles further, the need to frame what is happening as a phase begins to fade. There is less interest in naming it, tracking it, or figuring out where it leads. The mind may still look for context, but there is no urgency behind the search. Uncertainty does not feel like a gap waiting to be closed. It becomes part of the background, something you function inside without resistance. This is an important shift. When not knowing stops creating pressure, it is no longer a problem to solve. It does not interrupt movement or clarity. It simply exists without demanding interpretation. You are not waiting for direction to return. You are not preparing for a moment of insight. The system is already operating without those references. What once would have felt like being in between now feels complete in itself, even if nothing has been named. Because of that, attempts to extract meaning from this state tend to fall away on their own. There is no sense that something is hidden here that must be uncovered. Experience does not ask to be translated into understanding. It does not point beyond itself. This can feel subtle to the point of being almost invisible, especially if you were used to measuring progress through intensity or insight. But the absence of that measurement is the point. When the system is unhooked, it no longer needs to validate its position through interpretation. Life continues without commentary, and that continuity does not feel lacking. It feels sufficient. The state does not need to be protected or reinforced. It holds without effort. As this state stabilizes, a final shift becomes noticeable in how little needs to be carried forward. There is no sense of accumulation, no feeling that you should take something from this and apply it later. What has shifted does not require memory to remain active. You are not holding a conclusion. You are not storing an insight. The system is simply operating differently, and that operation does not depend on conscious reinforcement. This is why trying to summarize or crystallize the experience often feels unnecessary. Nothing improves by being defined. The absence of urgency is not something to preserve. It is the natural condition when nothing is pulling. What remains is light, not because it is elevated, but because there is less being carried. Fewer internal obligations, fewer unfinished loops. Experience moves forward without dragging meaning behind it. There is nothing to do from here and nothing to resolve. If you are unhooked, that is already complete. You do not need to stay in this state or avoid leaving it. You are not meant to protect it or turn it into an identity. When engagement is required, it will happen. When it is not, there is no loss in that. This is not a conclusion and not an arrival. It is a functioning baseline that does not announce itself. The absence of confusion is not clarity, and the absence of urgency is not emptiness. It is simply what remains when the hooks stop working. And from this point, life does not need to be approached differently. It continues on its own without being pulled or resisted.